Sourcing uranium is a difficult thing as well, and then what do you do when it's depleted at the end of its life? What do you do with it then?
France built almost 60 nuclear power stations in a 15-year period in the 70s and 80s. They reaped massive economies of scale in doing that. And what's happened for 30 years is we've offshored CO2 production, still being produced. Yeah. It's just being produced in other countries. I have no doubt if the European authorities were sufficiently dogged about it, they could force every vehicle on the road to be electric. The question is, at what price?
So how can we increase the belief in data in this kind of post-truth world that we have?
America has actually, in this area, I would say, a much more tenacious desire for the truth. We have moved things progressively offshore. In this perverse world where you set something up as a metric which you know is not true, you lead to perverse outcomes. And it's exactly the same as Dieselgate. You set up a test, a measure which you knew to be wrong. So if we were to scrap all the environmental things today, it would be great for people today and terrible for people tomorrow.
Hi, I'm Chris Caldwell, and welcome to Season 3 of Conversations on Climate. Nick, thank you so much for taking the time and for arranging us to come into Imperial here at one of your workplaces to record this. Very generous.
A pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Great. So before we get into the dark side of EVs and all things data, what type of environmentalist would you see yourself as, or would you consider yourself to be a lone wolf and very much on your own, uncategorizable?
And that is one of the hardest questions you can ask someone like me, or anyone really. The answer really is, I don't have any policy prescription. Firstly, the policies need to be based on actual data and empirical information, and accurate empirical information. Emissions analytics was born of Dieselgate, which is absolutely a question of, we were told something which turned out to be wrong. We can argue long and hard about who knew what before it all blew up, but everyone was being encouraged to make decisions based on data which was wrong. So the one thing we can be sure of, if people are given the wrong information, they can't do anything else but probably make the wrong decision. But I will go a little bit further and say probably the best way to characterize my type of environmentalism would be to say, well, actually, the internal combustion engine particularly, but all forms of transportation have led to immense progress in human well-being, culture, interpersonal contact, diversity of thought, a richness that people 300 years ago would have probably not even been able to conceive. And so really that's something we want to protect, enhance, but without wrecking the planet. So in economic terms or mathematical terms, it would be a constrained optimization problem. We want to maximize that, but subject to not wrecking the planet or making our cities so unlivable that it leads to early deaths, terrible quality of life. But on a global scale, the amount of technological advance is enormous. And so I think it is more likely we will solve our environmental problems through technological advance rather than banning and restricting things. And I think most democratic societies, we're beginning to see the pushback already of supposedly well-meaning, beneficent central authorities saying what should happen is not going to wash with democratic populations. It may not even wash with populations in more authoritarian regimes. Our best way of not wrecking the planet is probably by technological advance, and so I think we need to even refocus on making sure those incentives to innovation are right, and also the nuts and bolts of the economics of it, the liquidity of the financial markets funneling investments into these sorts of technologies, proper ownership of risk. We've got just a problem emerging. just like the financial crisis, or analogous to the financial crisis of privatization of gain and nationalization of risk. And that, with all the subsidies, the begging bowl of subsidies that is now, being rattled all across Europe, that's essentially that, nationalization of the risk.
It would be great to think that there will be a technological solution that comes in and changes everything. Can't really bet on that. The stakes are too high, so I do think we.
Well, there is a technological solution already, but it's a technological solution that society is currently not willing to take, which is massive rollout of nuclear fission.
Nuclear fission,
Yeah.
really?
Old style nuclear power.
Right.
And you can see the economic advantage France has got currently by their long-sighted investment in it in the 70s and 80s. They have significantly lower energy prices than other European countries as a result. That is plentiful green energy. And so there is, we know how to do it. They've never had a serious safety issue. So we could do that. We could replace fossil fuels on a mass scale if countries, and I think The Economist did a calculation, and hopefully they'll forgive me if I'm misattributing this, but I think it was them that did the calculation that the world would need to build 3,000 nuclear fission plants to essentially transition to non-fossil fuel energy backbone.
So you touched upon Dieselgate earlier on, and it's like part of the big overarching themes we're going to be talking about today are really around data. So can you give us a little bit of background into Dieselgate?
Yes, and actually Dieselgate is a topic which isn't actually, strangely, particularly well understood. People genuinely associate it with what Volkswagen did in America. But that was really only the touch paper. What was interesting about it and what makes it so much bigger scandal than just one company who deployed defeat devices and got punished, because that's, would have got over that in a few months, was that it pointed to a much bigger crisis which affected primarily Europe but also Asia, of effectively pretty much every manufacturer deploying defeat devices, yet it being unclear whether those defeat devices were illegal or not illegal. And if you look at the legal cases going through the courts in the UK, in some parts of Asia at the moment, even now where we are getting towards 9 years after Dieselgate, it is still unresolved as to whether these devices were illegal defeat devices or not. What is true, and where the data comes in, so we know that on average diesel vehicles in Europe of that generation were emitting about 5 times the regulated limit. So not double, 5 times. So there's something wrong. Even if they turn out to be technically legal, all that means is that there would have been something seriously deficient in the regulation in the first place that could allow vehicles to emit 5 times on the road and still be legal. If they're obviously found to be illegal, then that will lead to a chain of events of liability. And I was one of the first people, along with colleagues here at Imperial, in 2013 to publish real-world data saying there is a major problem here affecting European diesels. And for 2 years, no one really wanted to know. And it was a really good case in point. And I'm going through this because actually the echoes of this in the current climate change debate are very instructive, I think, is that no one wanted to know because the system produced numbers that everyone liked. So governments thought that they were meeting their NOx limits, manufacturers, their cars were compliant, and consumers in the thing, they saw Euro 6 in the brochure and thought, well, that must be good, I'm doing the right thing by trading up my Euro 4 for a Euro 6, that's a good decision. It just turned out this factory of false numbers. Why there's a parallel with the climate change as well is this is exactly what we're being told with battery electric vehicles at the moment. We're being told repeatedly there's zero emission. And they're not. And I mean, they're good in many respects, but they're not zero emission. But people are making decisions on the basis of zero emission, which is ultimately a false number.
Okay, so my understanding, I'm sure that it's a pretty kind of collective common understanding of what the Dieselgate, the Volkswagen emissions scandal is all about. It sounds slightly different towards what you're describing. So I'll just say what I think the common understanding is, and you kind of correct me if I'm wrong, is that there was a push to get into the US. And diesel vehicles were not de rigueur there, as they were in Europe. There was significant support in Europe for diesel vehicles, for good reasons and bad. In the US, there was a negative association for diesel vehicles. A bunch of guys, I assume all male, got into a room, because if there was kind of gender parity, you'd be relatively confident that the decision wouldn't be made. But a bunch of guys got together in a room and decided, okay, well, what we can do is we will put in some software and some hardware, so that when the vehicle's wheels are spinning, but they're not moving, it actually looks like, emissions levels drop, so it can pass any tests. And then they pushed to that and had a big marketing push to say, well, look how low our emissions are. Embrace diesel's wonderful. Then a few years later, some people looked at the data and went, wait, this makes no sense.
In material terms, that is a fair description of the touch paper.
Right.
That is. We don't really need to get into the details of the nature of the algorithm, but yes, seeing that the wheels were spinning but the vehicle was not moving was part of that, essentially to detect whether they were being subjected to their official certification test or not. Mm-hmm. And then as soon as they weren't on the real road, you flip to a dirty mode, because it gives the owner better MPG.
Right. Oh.
And the American market is very sensitive to fuel economy. And you're absolutely right that the backdrop of it was Americans had a very bad view on diesel passenger cars, because the very earliest diesel cars that were brought to the market a few decades before were really noisy, dirty, really didn't sit well with the preferences of the American market. So came with a backdrop of that. And then you had Volkswagen, who essentially wanted to become the biggest car manufacturer in the world, and up against Toyota, and they quite logically decided to, right, what's our competitive advantage? We're very good at diesel engines, which is true, and they were and they are. So they decided to bring diesel to America. They had this whole theme around, and based on their advertising campaign, of clean diesel. So you had forget old dirty diesel. This is a completely different thing. This is clean diesel. This is great. And it could have been. I mean, that is the amazing thing of this. It could have been. And at the same time as Volkswagen were selling their supposedly clean but actually dirty diesels, BMW and Mercedes were selling diesels into the American market that were genuinely clean.
Interesting.
Yeah. We're sitting here with a diesel engine right underneath us. Yeah. The diesel engine is an absolutely miraculous piece of technology, that changed the world when it was first invented in the late 19th century. In terms of its efficiency, its cleanliness, if done properly, and also its forgiveness as to the quality of fuel. Petrol engines, gasoline engines are very fussy, whereas diesel engines are very flexible. And when Rudolf Diesel originally invented the diesel engine, he envisaged it being powered by biofuels, not fossil fuels. Had that happened, the world would have gone on a very different path. So we are throwing away a miraculous technology because of this very unfortunate episode of cheating. But for your listeners and viewers, for absolute clarity, I am not saying we should continue with diesel engines fossil fuel powered. We cannot possibly do that for CO2 reasons. But what fuel you put in is a different thing from the nature of how you combust it. And there are options around non-fossil diesels that I would probably go so far as we will inevitably be forced to look at as part of the energy transition.
But getting back to the kind of the data integrity point, so your business is to be collecting and understanding data and putting it into a form that is useful for decision making. That seems like something we should be doing more of. Like, how can we increase the belief in data in this kind of post-truth world that we have?
Well, I would say there's a very interesting contrast between America and Europe. I think this may sound counterintuitive, given one particular individual in America is particularly at the vanguard of the post-truth society who might get re-elected later this year. But America has actually, in this area, I would say, a much more tenacious desire for the truth than Europe.
Interesting.
And not perfect, nowhere is perfect, but they have essentially much better funded official regulatory bodies and research bodies, and a much stronger legal mandate and underpinning. So if you take the Clean Air Act 1970, it gives very strong mission and funding. And then you have the inherent competition with the state regulators, particularly the California Air Resources Board. They effectively act to outdo each other in terms of toughness. So they've created, part by design, maybe part by luck, maybe just part by the American Constitution, a situation which is in much more vigorous pursuit of the truth and vigorous pursuit of anyone who violates it. Whereas Europe has essentially relatively poorly funded institutions which are driven primarily by politics, the politics of the European Union, very close ties to industry. And when it comes to developing most regulations, essentially the European Commission would decide, right, we want to regulate this, and then hands it over to the industry to devise their own regulations. So this is dressed up, this will be dressed up, and I'm sure the European Commission, if they were around the table here, would vehemently deny this. But if you look at and participate in the sessions and understand how it actually works, there is a great reliance of the authorities on the industry to mark their own homework in a very subtle second-order way, but to mark their own homework.
Kind of going back to the data collection and analysis, you've described very well how like your system does it in a this is just taking a particular example of the tailpipe emissions. Like that's something that is instinctively quite easy to understand and comprehend, and you can see the value of it, and you can see how it will be done. When you get into kind of more complex systems, like if you're looking at like a coal plant or a iron ore mine, or even the kind of microplastics we talked about, how do you go about kind of collecting data within a far more complicated system?
Increasingly, there are not easy answers. No. Give you a concrete example. We're finding, on average, there are 410 organic compounds in an average tyre. And each of which have different environmental and health effects. That's in an average tyre. So that you could spend your whole life researching just that particular area.
I'd like to kind of touch on a few of the areas that we talked about earlier on. One of them, as you've just mentioned, is tailpipe emissions. We know tailpipe emissions are bad. We know they're damaging to human health. We know how to solve it. We know how to fix it. Why do we continue to tolerate?
Well, we know how to fix tailpipe emissions, except for CO2,
right?
Except for carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a frustratingly unreactive gas that is very hard to scrub. There is no method of scrubbing at the tailpipe, but we've pretty much cracked everything else, or could with existing technology, to the point, and please do not do this, but if you were to suck on your exhaust pipe, it would, on a vehicle you bought today, it wouldn't be anywhere near as hazardous as you think. So we have solved that. So it is a question of making sure that companies do deploy them, unlike Dieselgate, and also making sure through the lifespan of the vehicle they don't degrade. So we do need desperately enhanced annual inspection tests in countries. Netherlands, Germany, and a few countries have introduced enhanced tests, particularly around particle number, actually, which is doing great things in terms of weeding out the degraded internal combustion engines in the field. So we can cure tailpipe emissions except for CO2. So then you think, what on earth do we do with that CO2? Because we can't scrub it. So then you think, right, okay, how do we change the fuel to car? So, and the I guess the most extreme version of it are these synthetic fuels, where in factories you will suck CO2 out of the air, you'll electrolyze water, you'll combine the carbon and the hydrogen into a synthetic hydrocarbon, which you can then make up into synthetic petrol or diesel. And so you put it in engines, you don't need to change the engine at all, and it will produce CO2 when you burn it, just like a normal fossil fuel. However, it will have absorbed the same amount of CO2 when you made it. So net zero. Therefore, you can have a net zero internal combustion engine. At the moment, that's a very expensive solution. To make no bones about it, I mean, I think I see 5 times more expensive, something like that. But it is technologically possible. That is really the only way of addressing. So you can't get rid of CO2 at the tailpipe, right, but you can mitigate it upstream.
Yeah, and so the second thing I'd like to talk about is what you described as the greatest environmental problem that you never heard of. It's just, yeah, tires.
Yes.
Could we dig into that? That's a really fascinating area.
And we've now been studying it for 5 years, and the more we look into it, the more complex it becomes. So it's a really knotty problem. And also, for clarity, again, before we go any further, this is a problem for all sorts of vehicles, not just electric vehicles. But there are essentially 3 problems with tyres. There's how you make them, how you use them, and how you dispose of them. How you make them, it's about, can you minimise the toxicity of the stuff going in and the energy intensity of the manufacturing process. For the usage, it's about limiting the amount of wear, the invisible particles that are shed from, and how toxic they are. And then the end of life is just as difficult. You've got about 2 billion tyres a year coming to the end of life, and what we do with them. And the lion's share at the moment are dumped somewhere or burned. And that is not good for the environment because you're releasing CO2 and a lot of toxic pollutants when you're burning them. So, but this all tracks back to what's in tyres. There's a lot of toxic chemicals in tyres. Most people don't even know that. People assume that tyres are made of rubber from rubber trees, and that sounds all very bio and organic and lovely. That was true until the Second World War, when synthetic rubber was devised, and actually synthetic rubber turned out to have some fantastic properties and be very cheap. Okay. And it swept the market. So if you buy an average car tyre today, it'll have about only 10% natural rubber. Most of the rest is from fossil fuel. So that's the origin of the problem. So it has terrible parallels with tailpipe emissions. It all traces back to fossil fuels. Right. One we're burning, one we're wearing away. And really, ultimately, the solution is getting away from fossil fuels for that as well. But in the meantime, through the usage of tyres, an average car in Europe will probably lose between 1 and 2 kilograms of material a year. So even though you don't know you're doing it, and this will be your tyre rubber, and this adds up to about 6 million tonnes per year globally. That's what's being silently shed into the environment. And no one really gave it a second thought outside very narrow set of researchers until about 5 years ago. Finally, after years of research as to why half of their salmon populations were dying on the west coast. And through painstaking research, they worked out it happened during heavy rainfall. So the theory was then, maybe that's runoff, stormwater runoff from roads and stuff. And they tracked it back and worked out that actually there's one single chemical in tyres which was causing it, and which only is really in tyres. So they managed to not just find the chemical, but a chemical where the source was known, which was tyres, and that's a chemical called 6-PPD. Okay. It's a preservative put in tyres to stop them cracking and drying out. So they provide a vital role. And what's particularly interesting and difficult about 6-PPD is there's no alternative to it. Right. Or no real alternative to it at the moment. We do know that it's making its way into the food chain as well. So tests on various comestibles that are grown in fields show the presence of 6-PPD. So we know it's omnipresent, we just don't know what the effect is. They have shown that it affects some trouts, some other living creatures as well, but they haven't proven it on much more sophisticated organisms yet. So that's one we have to just put in the bucket of we don't know yet. Is there reason to be Worried, yes, to some extent by the nature of the chemical mechanism and that it does have on fish. So there's good reason to research it as a matter of priority, and that's why California's rule, which is forcing tyre companies to look at alternatives, is really, good timing.
Yeah, and even if it is fine for us, but it's impacting the food systems, well, ultimately it has a impact on.
And you mentioned microplastics as well. That's probably one where we are more confident that microplastics are having harm. Should we actually go back to natural rubber tyres? Should that be the solution to our tyres? Why not? Well, we would have to turn over vast amounts of land to cultivate natural rubber. It's a difficult thing to grow. And it's very susceptible to blight. So that's tricky in itself. Maybe at a push we could do it, but the one thing I can guarantee it would mean is your tyres will be a lot more expensive. And they wouldn't perform as well either, because natural rubber, it has some positive aspects, but it also has some downsides in its susceptibility to damage. So you would probably have much more expensive and less good tyres. You'd solve the environmental problem, but at a price. And that is just a really good single example of these environmental conundrums, is that there's trade-offs. This is not a moralistic thing about should we save animal X or do we need to eliminate pollutant Y. If we were to democratically decide that we were going to make our tyres 3 times more expensive, and we as a country were going to invest in the rubber plantations to do that, that's a perfectly legitimate decision to make.
Sure. Just
like if we were to decide that we are all going to buy electric vehicles which are 40% more expensive, fine. But it has to spring from either a free market decision that just actors legally go about doing it, or we have a democratically mandated policy, then fine. Sure. But it will, if you make those things more expensive, it does in effect reduce our quality, one aspect of our quality of life. Yeah. So we would be able to afford to drive less as the price of that environmental advantage.
But we do need to properly price things. Like at the moment, we're talking about tyres existing and costing X because there's no price attached to all these externalities. That's the other impacts that they're having on human life, on fish life, on the environment in general. If you could, through data, get a proper price on that and say this is your actual price on tyres, well, you don't know what that outcome might be. It might be that you're still cheaper using these tyres, but it might be that you're actually cheaper going for the other alternative. The same with, there's so many of these arguments around it's more expensive to go for this option, but it's only more expensive to go for this option because you're not pricing in the impacts of what you're doing.
I think that's an absolutely spot on point. Completely agree with that, and that should be the proper role of government, to make sure that the prices that we face and industry faces properly reflects the total environmental damage. And it can be done. It's simpler in some areas than others, but it can be done. And it is a whole load better than going around and moralistically banning things that are not the flavour of the month. And because governments are very bad at picking those. But there's also one crucial thing, and it really speaks to the economic efficiency of it, is if you price things properly, what it's implicitly saying is it is okay still for you to go and use those tyres or burn that fossil fuel in your engine, but if you're going to do it, you're going to pay the proper price for doing it. And actually, that generates revenue that then can be recycled into investing in new technologies, or it can be investing in compensating those who suffer because they live on the South Circular. That person is voluntarily paying over a bunch of money that can be used for good other things, but it is not directing people to stop doing things. So there's still a constrained free choice there, and that, from the point of view of taking a democratic population along with you, is a much, much better way of doing it. It's much more economically efficient, and it doesn't require some benign, wise central government choosing technologies. And as we know, governments are rarely benign nor wise.
Great. Yeah, and before we move on, there's one thing that you touched on earlier on that sounded really interesting. You're talking about how you're better off outside the car rather than inside it, which sounds kind of counterintuitive. Like, could you tell us a little bit about the VOCs and falling asleep and how all of the stuff that's inside the car is actually impacts on you and your health?
Yeah, there's inside the car, there's three things to worry about. There is particles particularly coming in from outside, so they get in through the ventilation system, and once they're in, because cars are so well made these days, they get stuck and just get circulating round and round. The second one is carbon dioxide. So if you reach for that recirculation button because you're worried about the particles getting in, you think, right, okay, I'm going to put the air on recirculation. Very quickly, the carbon dioxide in the cabin will start going up because you're getting no fresh air in. And the third one is, and it's particularly bad in hot countries, it's the chemicals vaporizing from all the interior materials. And they are those VOCs, the volatile organics, which are often carcinogenic and have other health issues. So you've got this chemical soup. So you're sitting in a cauldron of chemicals as you drive along.
So that new car smell is actually harming you.
It is. Well, I mean, clearly people are not dropping dead. We're talking chronic problems, not acute problems. They're not dropping dead out the wheel. But yes, a lot of those things. There's about 7 kilograms of glue in an average new car. Because we tend to glue things together, not rivet them together anymore. And that glue has to go somewhere. So some of it is evaporating into the cabin, and that's one of the constituents of the new car smell. The Chinese are so sufficiently worried about it, they're introducing a regulation around the new car smell to get rid of it. I mean, so the Chinese actually are onto a good thing again on this, is that for them, if you smell the new car smell, that's bad. Right. Whereas in the West, we think of that as that's the cachet of a new car. But that's bad because that's the volatile organics. The particles you don't generally smell, but if a lot get in, you will sit in there re-inhaling them as you drive. So there's a big exposure there. And the CO2, if you have the recirc on for even half an hour, you can get up to 2,000 ppm of CO2, which you're not going to pass out, but it will begin to slow your cognitive reactions. And one thing when you're driving in charge of a car is you want to have sharp reactions. So it will begin in basically a linear basis. The more CO2, the slower your reactions will get. It doesn't really get really problematic until 10,000 ppm. Now that would require quite a long bit of driving with 3 or 4 passengers in the car, but that still happens.
It happens.
It still does happen. Now, in a way, the sort of get out of jail free card on many of these things is, well, just open the window. And actually, there's quite a lot of truth in there. Just open the window. But we keep the window closed for good reason, for comfort. Also, for the air conditioning in a hot country, you want to deliberately keep the cabin cool.
Interesting. So, kind of putting all that together, and we haven't even talked about the manufacturing process and the extraction process to get the materials to build vehicles. Is it possible to get a clean and healthy car? Like, is it as a concept? Is it even a thing? Like, can you do it?
So, we talked about tailpipe. We can get rid of the pollutants largely. We could get rid of most of the things in the vehicle cabin as well, with a combination of good filtration and changing materials. I think within some years we will be able to make tyres quite a lot less toxic. So I think we can progressively really bear down on the toxic elements. The one that is the really stubborn one is CO2.
Okay.
And that is whether it's burnt in the engine, but increasingly it will be in the manufacturing process of all the materials going in. So I think what we're likely to see is vehicles where the environmental damage is not from the use phase, it's from the manufacturing phase, proportionally. So we are putting more energy. So an electric vehicle has more embedded energy because we've had to dig up, not just dig up, but refine all these metals and create the battery. So there's much higher embedded CO2 in the thing, but much lower CO2 when you use it. I think that's part of a general trend. And so the focus has got to be increasingly on the manufacturing, the upstream part of the conundrum. And this provides a particular challenge for Europe and America, particularly Europe, because we have gone on a 30-year spree of offshoring the manufacturing of things. But if there's one thing we really need to solve, it's the CO2. And that's why my nuclear power thought experiment is one example of, why we need to be thinking about it now is because that's the knotty bit to solve, the CO2, not so much the pollutant emissions. We could crack those.
Sure, but that means moving to EVs. So the nuclear is part of the solution kind of presupposes that we've moved away from all combustion engines and everything.
Well, no, not necessarily, because nuclear could equally be used to create synthetic liquid fuels.
Okay.
So the conundrum at the moment is, so we either use that...
It's really expensive, though.
It is really expensive, but the hidden expense with electrification is that we have got to go and change the powertrain in every single vehicle on the planet.
Okay, but we talk about hidden expense. You don't want to open up the hidden expense box and have nuclear on the table. Like that's hidden expenses are all over that industry.
But no. But I did know. But if you build nuclear power stations one at a time, well, I've decided this sort of artisanal approach to nuclear power stations is going to be monumentally expensive. Yes, undoubtedly, and that's what we're doing at the moment.
It is. Yeah.
France built almost 60 nuclear power stations in a 15-year period in the 70s and 80s. They reaped massive economies of scale in doing that. To the extent that even today, their electricity price is something like half their neighbouring countries. So there's a massive economy of scale in doing that.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't advocate doing nuclear piecemeal. You would do nuclear on a very large scale.
Sure, but you then end up creating the very large problems of depleted uranium, also where you find the raw materials in the first place, where you refine them, because again, like the refinement is principally in places that we're not very good friends with. Like it's Russia, it's the stands in and around there. That's where you do get to refine uranium. Sourcing uranium is a difficult thing as well. And then what you do when it's depleted at the end of its life, what do you do with it then? I know. We're shifting from one pollutant to another, from one problem to another.
Well, indeed. So, and there's absolutely this is trade-offs, and there is no miraculous solution. I mean, just like wind turbines is not a miraculous. Wind turbines is not zero emission and doesn't come with downsides. I mean, the single biggest problem with wind is intermittency. And so, what's your storage mechanism? So, none of these are perfect solutions. So, if you asked my personal opinion, setting aside just reviewing data aesthetically, I would say that nuclear will be a material part of the solution, but it won't. It's not like we'll need that as a singular option, because actually I think wind and solar is very promising, and also the other technological developments that we're coming up with all the time. So it'll probably be part of a mix, just like I think the powertrains on the road will end up as a mix. I do not believe we will go to full electrification of vehicles on the road. We will end up with a mix because different technologies have different pros and cons, and there is a benefit in risk spreading. You don't want to be completely dependent on one singular technology, unless it happens to be just better in every respect and cheaper, and rarely do you find a technology which is better in every respect. So you run with a mix, and it gives you a diversity, and it allows people to choose what the best thing for their purposes are. So that's why I think that will be the end game in the energy generation, and will be reflected, mirrored in terms of our vehicles on the road as well.
That's interesting, because that's slightly contrary to, at least in Europe, policy. Because policy seems to be pushing towards no more internal combustion engine vehicles after points in time, depending on the country. Could you kind of square that circle?
Well, I mean, it may not survive contact with reality for much longer. I mean, it's true that it is a policy, and what is also true is that Europe is incredibly strongly wedded to this policy. And to very deep levels of international agreements, and it's undoubtedly true that the lobbying power of the organisations pushing electrification have managed to muster now at least as much resource to counter the fossil fuel lobby. So they've guided policymakers in a very particular way. Basically, banning a technology that Europe has a competitive advantage in favour of one that another country has a competitive advantage in. Yes, we could do that, but is it a cost that ultimately a democratic population will be willing to accept? I have no doubt if the European authorities were sufficiently dogged about it, they could force every vehicle on the road to be electric. Question is, at what price? And I don't think, and as people start staring it in the face, of how expensive that is, they'll realise that's not the pragmatic way. So I think it will be driven from the economics more than anything else. And I'll give you one concrete example of how high the price has already gone. Is that in the UK, so market share of pure electric vehicles has been stuck at about 16% for almost 2 years now. So the industry is now getting jittery, as you can imagine. And so the SMMT just before Christmas came, feeding into the budget coming later this week, has been asking for subsidies. For
SMMT?
The Society for Motor Manufacturers and Traders, the trade body for the UK manufacturing industry, has asked for subsidies equivalent to £7.7 billion over 3 years to yield an extra 270,000 sales of battery electric vehicles. And this is like to turbocharge. What that actually, when you do the maths, is that for each extra electric vehicle you sell, the taxpayer is being asked to spend £28,500. So,
right,
more than half the list price of the vehicle per unit. That's just not going to be democratically acceptable. I mean, that's, in America they have incentives of $7,500 per unit, and that's seen as pretty spicy. $28,500 pounds, beg your pardon, pounds. That's not going to fly. And that's today where there's still a lot of early days excitement about battery electric vehicles. How are you going to drive it? I mean, let's say we went along with that and it started getting electric vehicles into the mass market. What do you do with the stubborn tail of 30% of people who don't want to shift at all? It gets progressively more expensive as you want to squeeze out those last people. So 7.7 billion, that is the UK for 3 years, relatively early on the transition process. The numbers get mind-bending when you think if you really wanted to force it through. And that's why I don't think and I'm sure a lot of people in this area are very well-meaning and can envisage a all-electric future. And boy, would it be nice from a smoothness of driving, quietness, efficiency point of view. There's so many merits to it.
They are great.
There's so many merits to it. And some of these vehicles are stunning. It doesn't work from a energy transition at a cost we're likely to be willing to afford. And it'll take, but in the very long game, we might get there. But we really do need to reconceive a transition which goes through progressive technology. It also has at every stage a diversity of technologies, so we can find the most efficient way. We incentivize innovation.
Okay. Well, what's the pro-climate case then for the internal combustion engine?
Well, the pro-climate is that you can hybridize everything very quickly.
Okay.
So a hybrid, and I'm talking a non-plug-in hybrid, just a standard hybrid, let's say will deliver you a 25% efficiency improvement over a standard petrol internal combustion engine. So you can gain 25% CO2 reduction for an increase in ticket price of that vehicle of, let's be cautious and say 10%. Oh. And it doesn't require people to change their behaviour at all, because they don't have to plug in, drive, do whatever they've previously done. So it's hardly more expensive. They don't have to change their behaviour, and you get 25% improvement. It is perfectly plausible to think you could get basically the whole of the fleet hybridised within a fairly short space of time. So you can lock in 25% reduction for next to no investment.
Yeah. But you're also, this is a lifetime asset of 10 years, say, so you're also locking in to 75% of none.
Yeah, absolutely you are. I mean, you absolutely are. I mean, we could say, is net zero by 2050 viable? Now, that'll be a valid question to ask. So I'm not working backwards from the, right, that's the end point and we've just got to make the numbers fit that. It's a legitimate question as to whether that is possible or not. But what I would like to do is lock in that 25% quickly, while there's lots of innovation going on, which will then take us to the next level. And after all, currently, on average, electric vehicles are only 50% less than a standard gasoline when you incorporate the manufacturing emissions.
Okay.
So on a life cycle basis, average EV is about 50% less. So the hybrid gets you halfway there. If we remain stuck at 15% market share of EVs, and let's say didn't do any hybrids, that would be worse for CO2 than doing my rapid hybridization. I suppose what's the difference in dimension? It's speed. It's the speed with which you can do it. I don't believe we can get to 100% penetration in the new vehicle market of battery electric vehicles by 2035 without massive expense of taxpayers' money, which is probably unpalatable.
Very early on, you made a kind of compelling argument about the benefits of vehicles, the benefits of for humanity of us being able to get in our cars and driving around the place. But if we're also looking at it from the point of view where it's really hard to find a genuinely clean car, a car that isn't damaging to the environment in its across its life cycle, isn't the answer to be trying to be making public transport better, to be getting people out of their cars, to be trying to let's say just in a utopian world have efficient, timely, free public transport available for all. Just really massively reduce the amount of people in cars.
That's a thorny topic, but I'll try. So in headline. So first thing we have to realise, so let's exclude walking for a second. The vast majority of journeys that human beings make in developed countries is by the motor car. It's not evenly spread. If you look at it as a city dweller, you might think it's dominated by public transport. If you look at it, don't forget the country folk. And the less developed countries, and also countries that never really embrace public transport, like America, where it's not. The vast majority of trips that people make are in the private motor car. So if you got, let's say, 10% of people out of their car, 10% reduction in that. That doesn't mean a 10% increase in public transport. That may well mean you've got to increase the public transport provision by 50%. Or maybe double it. You'll be displacing a huge amount of transportation activity. So then you get into the problem of expanding public transport is expensive. So no, when I say public transport is expensive, I make no comment so much about its retail cost. It's how much does it cost to operate the system, and all those systems are expensive. So it could be done, but it's a choice. Then you've got, can you do modal shift to cycling and walking?
Should. There's so many benefits to the human of walking and cycling.
Absolutely right. I couldn't agree with you more. COVID gives us an interesting data point here. So obviously lots of people went to cycling and walking instead of the car, particularly instead of public transport. Since COVID, what has happened? Cycling has gone back pretty much to where it was before, roughly. The one thing that's stayed high is walking. And actually I think that reveals that actually it is something that people are willing to change their life and incorporate in their lifestyle, and they do it because they feel it's better, and it is better, and that's the experience of it. So that's been a great, and the more we can do of that, the better. There's also the other form is, I think probably the biggest saving of car transportation is just shaving off the 10% of journeys you just don't really need to do, are very marginally beneficial. And that's where it comes back to what you mentioned about externalities and taxing the externalities. If we put a proper price on petrol and diesel, if we put a proper price on motorcycles or whatever it is, the first thing that would happen is people would just curtail their activity. They would stop doing those journeys that really they didn't, an aunt they didn't really like very much. It was a good excuse not to go and see her, something like that. So you would, and that's actually that is the cheapest environmental improvement. Just stop doing things which you didn't really want to do in the first place. But also you get if you go for the free public transportation, the free bikes or very cheap bikes everywhere around, the e-scooters. If you make the average price of transportation less, what you will have is people travelling more. So you have to beware of that income effect, it's called, whereby you will have people making more journeys because you've made the public transport. So you will get, so if you made the train system free, you would get people switching undoubtedly from cars to trains, a lot. You would also get a whole bunch of people who previously weren't making journeys, now making journeys.
That's great.
And we found, but you would need to size the infrastructure. You would need to size the train infrastructure to accommodate that, which is then huge investment. And there is actually a concrete example in the UK with the free bus passes for pensioners. What happened when that was introduced under New Labour, I think it was in the late 1990s, was that a lot of pensioners started taking bus trips that they previously didn't take, because it was free. So you have a substitution effect, but you also have an income effect as well. Yeah. And what that means is you must make sure that infrastructure is then properly sized to accommodate that, and that comes at a cost.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see what the impact on the pensioners was of that, because if they were going out and taking trips they wouldn't have done when they couldn't afford it, what was the impact on their lives of being able to make that trip, going and doing something
that's
they decided to do?
Yeah, that's a good welfare point. It may well have been that they increased their quality of life. That's a very valid point. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
Cool. So one thing that we kind of teased around and kind of tipped it around a bit was the impacts that electrification and kind of moving towards EVs rather than electrification will have on the European auto industry. You say that moving from an area where there's a strong competitive advantage to an area where there's actually a strong competitive disadvantage because the Chinese are so much better at it and so much further ahead. You've kind of described potentially very negative outcomes for the European industry on that. Could you dig into that a little bit first?
Well, yeah, on a simple level, effectively, European governments are effectively banning the technology that Europe does well. The Chinese never managed to master the internal combustion engine. It's one of Europe's great strengths, particularly the diesel internal combustion engine. Unfortunately, the Dieselgate happened. So it would be like any other industry where you suddenly ban something that your domestic producers were good at. That is going to come at a significant shrinkage in that industry, therefore reduction in jobs, reduction in consumer choice, all the benefits that will need to be applied by government through a retraining of people to whatever the growing industries are. So that's the nature of the significant cost. That's before you get into the ongoing, right? China will then have a inbuilt advantage in perpetuity, unless they muck it up, of all the established supply chains to sell battery electric vehicles to Europeans for an ongoing period. It would be very hard then for Europeans to try and compete against that. So where does that leave us? So that leaves us either we've got to reverse what is a policy that will inevitably bring that about, and you'll hear. Now, I'm being very careful. I'm not actually saying necessarily that's a bad policy, but that policy will bring this about, and you voters be the judge. So we could reverse that policy and go to a more mixed model that I've talked about, which I think actually would be better at achieving the environmental goal quickly as well. So, yeah, if you tease me into making a policy statement, think again about that policy. But if we're going to double down on it, then the logical thing to do is all Europe can do. They either say, give up on the automotive space, right? We can, just like UK gave up in the 80s, gave up on a number of different manufacturing sectors. We've got no position in this. There's no way we're going to. Europe could say, right, actually, we've given it. In automotive, we know it's going to be permanently smaller. We're not going to obsess about it. We're going to retrain and redeploy people to, I don't know, AI or some new coming technology. And that actually might be an economically rational thing to do. In which case, I would strongly suggest that we do not put taxpayers' money into trying to prop up subsidise £28,500 per unit to prop up what are industries that you've strategically given up on anyway.
No, absolutely, 100%. Electric vehicles are not the be all. They're not the solution to everything. But one argument I don't think is being made enough is that it's a lot cheaper to be making the transition now than it is to wait for to not act and to wait for all of the impacts of climate change to come on in and be racking and ruining societies, blowing up food systems, like causing wildfires, all of these type of things.
Well, yes and no. Yes, and if we're to do nothing, let's say we did nothing, right? It would be great for people today. It'd be terrible for your children and grandchildren. So,
yeah, well, so your grandchildren wouldn't have a functioning society.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But it would be great for people today. So it's cheaper. It'd be cheaper and lovelier for people today to not do anything. And that's the dilemma. To what degree should you take into account the future of your children and grandchildren, but not just that, your friends' children and grandchildren, and people you don't know in Asia's children and grandchildren. And the reality of it is, people discount future generations, and particularly other people's future generations, very severely. Discount in a technical sense of how much weight in your calculus do you put on that. People tend to focus on their very close-knit family and friends today, and this is a human failing. I'm not saying this is good, but this is a human behavioural thing. So, if we were to scrap all the environmental things today, it would be great for people today and terrible for people tomorrow. So that's why you have to persuade people today of the benefits versus the costs, but in a way that it still comes back to it has to be the best mix that people will tolerate.
Okay, so just one final question, and it's how we always end. It's asking for a little bit of advice. So we'll just go back to the start. Where we start off with scandal. And also kind of bearing in mind you sense the straws in the wind that this scandal was coming, and set up a business in advance of it. Where do you see the next scandal in the climate space coming from, and how can listeners and viewers try and protect themselves so they're on the right side of it, not caught on the wrong side of it?
I mean, we're almost on top of that scandal now. It's just not been aired in the same way. I mean, when UK and European countries report their CO2 reductions, so we have this baseline of 1990, and all the reductions are judged relative to that baseline. That's production emissions. That's CO2 produced within the UK or European Union, not consumed.
Okay.
And what's happened for 30 years is we've offshored CO2 production, still being produced. Yeah. It's just being produced in other countries, and then we're importing those goods and consuming them here. And so we think, and governments trumpet the fact that we've reduced our CO2 emissions by a lot.
And use this as reasons for slowing down on our efforts.
Well, some do, some do. You're quite right.
Quite close to where we are right now. I've done exactly that thing. Yeah.
Who are you thinking about?
I can't possibly comment.
Well, no, but there are, that is a point. Yeah, well, that's a point of view in a democratic society. But essentially, that's just not true. So. Or you are choosing a metric which is knowingly misleading. Because the only thing that matters is actually reducing the amount of CO2 into the atmosphere through our activity, not through the factories that we happen to have sited in the UK. And not only is that deeply wrong and bad, just logically bad, scientifically bad, it also sets up terrible incentives. So it's in the UK government's incentive to shut down UK factories.
It's absurd.
And they've been very good at that. And we have moved things progressively offshore.
Yeah.
And that's great. And that's what, in this perverse world where you set something up as a metric which you know is not true, you lead to perverse outcomes. And it's exactly the same as Dieselgate. You set up a test, a measure which you knew to be wrong, knew to be inaccurate. It sets up then all sorts of perverse incentives. The car manufacturers then, the calculus was, is it cheaper and easier to build a cleaner car or to put a defeat device in? And it was almost always cheaper to put the defeat device in. Because you set up a bad test in the first place and you didn't police it and you didn't enforce it, if you're sitting in a manufacturer and you're presented with that option, you're going to cheat, aren't you? Well, maybe it'll turn out to be legally cheating, but it's manipulation nevertheless. So getting those metrics right and being constantly alert to whether they are still measuring the thing you thought they were measuring, and policing it and being honest and transparent about it is so central. It is so easy to be suckered into something which is politically tasty. But you will set up a terrible chain of events and set of incentives which will lead to something so bad. And that's where we are today. So we're not reducing CO2 in the way we thought, and we're shrinking our industry. Genius. You know, it beggars belief as to, so you need to get the metric right. This is a complex problem which will be expensive to fix. Complex problems that are expensive to fix need people to put their heads together, not just think they've got a simple solution and go and shout very loudly about it.
For sure, yeah. There's never a
more nuance than that.
Yeah. There's never a simple solution to complex answers, but very rarely. And we need more than ever experts like yourself. So thank you very much for the time and everything. Been a great conversation. Thank you very much for joining us on that conversation. We hope that you enjoyed it. We hope that you learned something. If you did enjoy it, please feel free to leave a 5-star review and to subscribe to any of our channels, and we'll be sure to keep you updated on future productions. These are conversations that you just can't afford to miss.